2 days after Wednesday's budget, the government has announced a national productivity plan whose aim is to get Britain's productivity moving, help improve it and bring it up to the levels seen in some of our main competitors. With me to discuss this is Jim Pickard, our chief political correspondent. Jim, we've heard lots for years about Britain's productivity problems. It's a big economic issue. Has the government found the answer this time?
Yeah, we all know that Britain has a productivity issue and that the French by Thursday evening have done as much work as a British worker has done by a Friday evening. There are lots of ways that the government is trying to address productivity today. None of them will necessarily be the silver bullet that solves that particular problem.
What are the key points of today's?
So the key things today are some very familiar themes. So he's talking about the Northern Powerhouse, devolving more power out towards the regions. There's also talk about apprenticeships. We saw in the budget on Wednesday that the government is putting much more onus on big business to pay for apprentices rather than relying on the state. And then much more detail we had in terms of planning reforms. Now, planning reforms are something that come and go every year or two. There are a whole load of different elements. There's maybe 6 or 7 different elements. That was probably the biggest amount of new detail we heard today.
How much difference is the planning reform going to make?
Interesting question. I've probably seen planning reviews, house building announcements from the government every 6 months, every 12 months for most of my adult life. Let's be honest. There were quite a few things here that were welcomed by the house builders today. Firstly, they're going to have new brownfield zones where you can build properties in an area of brownfield, that's to say kind of derelict former use site. So that'll become a little bit quicker. But in reality, a lot of these brownfield sites are not the places you might want to build homes.
Well, are these plans going to affect the green belts at all?
They've not talked about the green belt today. The green belt stays in its entirety as it is. And there are people who would like to go further. They'd like more reforms. They say that the green belt, despite its name, has quite a lot of land that is not green, as you and I would know it. So it doesn't address that. The last time the government shook up planning in a very big way was about 3 or 4 years ago when they introduced something called the National Planning Policy Framework. And that put an onus on development to the benefit of the economy, and they had a huge backlash, particularly from the right-wing press and from some of the Tory grassroots. They want to avoid that. So today the onus was much more on cities, on brownfield, and there wasn't an awful lot that you could argue against.
Well, in the cities, there's some measures for London, aren't there, that they're talking about, allowing people to extend their homes upwards. What's that about?
So you'll be able to develop your house upwards by 2 stories or as high as the adjacent building. Now, I've been trying to get reaction from Kensington Council, Westminster Council today, because you'd have thought there are going to be quite a few people who are concerned about that blighting their views or changing the feel of their neighbourhood. They've also got an extension of this rule that allows them to change the use of property, because residential property tends to be worth quite a lot more than particularly industrial property or offices. So there could be concerns that by liberalising that further and making that a permanent freedom, you could have a situation where you have something like Royal Park in West London, which is industrial. If that's all transformed into flats, and yes, there's a need for more residential property in London, but what happens to the industry there? Is it forced out of the city?
Right. I mean, there's a lot at stake, of course, isn't there, with productivity? If the UK doesn't get its productivity house in order, this could affect all the plans for economic growth, public finances, and so on.
Absolutely. It's one of the great conundrums that's bedeviled British industry for many years. And this could be a move in the right direction, but I think the idea that we wake up tomorrow and suddenly we're not 20% less efficient than our European competitors does seem a little bit far-fetched, but I think business sees it as certainly a step in the right direction.
There have been questions about infrastructure, which is very important for business. I mean, business is keen to see action on airports, road and rail links. What's happening in those areas?
So there was a big change in the budget that passed people by on Wednesday itself, whereby Network Rail is ceding some of the power over the actual over the actual tracks to the rolling stock companies. The companies that actually run the rail services will now have more control over the lines. So let's see what happens there. They talk a very good game on infrastructure, and every year we have this list of infrastructure projects that the government wants to see built. But when you look at the really big things, when you look at the ones that big business want to see built, we've had the Davis Commission on building a new runway in the southeast, and yet the government's still prevaricating over whether it's going to take the Davis recommendation of a Heathrow third runway, and they're going to do some consultation, and we might hear something by Christmas.
Well, that's probably the big one, isn't it? It's going to be the big one, to see whether or not they can take action on the airport. They're going to have to make up their minds by the end of the year whether they really do go ahead, give an extra runway to the southeast of England that's so badly needed. And perhaps that, more than anything else, will tell us whether they're really serious about fixing Britain's infrastructure. So, Jim, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleasure.